What is global warming?
Our story starts in 1896 in Sweden with this guy, Svante Arrhenius, a chemist. Arrhenius is the first person to figure out that putting CO2 into the atmosphere could make the Earth warmer. But the prevailing wisdom of the time says that there is an infallible balance of nature which no human actions could ever possibly disturb, so nobody takes Arrhenius very seriously until 1938, when an engineer named Guy Stewart Callender decides to look at global temperatures recorded over the past 50 years or so and figures out, hey, what do you know, the Earth is getting warmer. War breaks out in 1939. Ends in 1945. And as the world's economy recovers, industrial production goes into overdrive. Burning of coal and oil puts so much sulfur pollution into the atmosphere that it partially blocks the sun's rays, and the world actually gets slightly cooler over the next 3 decades. In the 1950s, scientists start looking more closely at the possible effects of CO2 emissions on global temperatures. For the first time, we start to realize that we could have a major problem on our hands.
A few degrees rise in the Earth's temperature would melt the polar ice caps.
But the Cold War is in full swing, and we have more immediate existential threats to think about, like nuclear holocaust.
Duck, and then cover.
In the 1960s, the cooling trend continues, and there's even some fringe speculation that we could be heading for a new ice age. That all changes in the mid-70s when temperatures start going up again. The phrase global warming makes its first appearance in a 1975 research paper. Temperatures keep rising throughout the 80s, and 1988 is the hottest year ever recorded to that point. This gets people's attention, and global warming starts to enter mainstream public awareness for the first time.
Human activities are changing the atmosphere.
We face a global environmental crisis.
The global threat of climate change.
Yes, that's Margaret Thatcher, one of the first world leaders to speak out about climate change. Interesting, right? Anyway, in 1995, an international group of scientists issues the first public statement that there is a discernible human influence on global climate. In 2001, they predict that 21st century warming will leave the 20th century in the dust. Over the next decade, some of the anticipated effects of global warming start happening. Things like rising oceans, intense droughts and heat waves, and powerful storms. The 15 hottest years in history have all occurred since 1998, and 2015 is on track to be the hottest year ever recorded. So what does the future hold? If we curb CO2 emissions, temperatures could rise as little as 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit by 2099. That would be manageable. If we don't, temperatures could rise more than 8 degrees, which would mean massive food shortages, widespread extinctions, and a redrawing of the world's coastlines. The story of global warming will end with a changed climate. That's inevitable at this point. How much it will change remains to be seen.
So, what is it? The answer is simple. It just ain't cool. What's causing global warming?
It's not the sun, which hasn't changed much since 1850. It's not volcanoes, which cool the Earth for a year or two when they erupt. It's not aerosols. These tiny particles and gases in pollution reduce warming as they cause clouds to reflect more of the sun's energy back to space. It's not changes in land use. The conversion of dark forest to paler pasture, which reflects more of the sun's light, has had a modest cooling effect. Is it ozone pollution? Increases in the lower atmosphere from human activity warm things a bit. Yes, it's greenhouse gases. Rising concentrations of greenhouse gases as a result of human activity are by far the biggest cause. When we compare human factors and natural factors, it's clear who's responsible for global warming.
Humans are responsible for global warming, and the main cause is greenhouse gas. Then, does it affect our world? Unfortunately, it does. The question is, what has it already caused?
You could almost say Irma looks beautiful. From ground level, though, she has a very different face. The Caribbean island of St. Martin hit by 185-mile-an-hour winds, and Irma is still going, heading perhaps for the US mainland. It is what we sometimes rather helplessly refer to as an act of God. No one to blame, nothing to be done but pick through the wreckage, mourn the dead, and count the cost. But with two major hurricanes, one after another, is this perhaps something else, an act of man, or at least man-made climate change? This year in the North Atlantic, there have so far been 11 named storms, of which 6 have been hurricanes. The average between 1981 and 2010 was 6 named storms and 2.6 hurricanes, so we appear to be well up. In terms of wind speed, Irma is the joint second strongest on record at 185 miles an hour, eclipsed only by Hurricane Allen in 1980 with a maximum wind speed of 190 miles an hour. And with 2.25 days at Category 5 intensity so far, Irma is the 4th longest duration hurricane on record, but still a whole day behind Hurricane Cuba, which in 1932 blew for 3.25 days. The mechanism by which a warming climate might cause more hurricanes seems pretty clear-cut.
The fuel that drives hurricanes.
And if we look at this graph produced by the US National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration last year, it does show a steady uptick of average sea temperatures. Hurricane Harvey is the US record breaker so far, but it's not by much. Tropical Storm Amelia in 1978 dumped 48 inches, and Hurricane Easy in 1950 dumped 45.2. And Tropical Storm Claudette in 1979 dropped 45 inches of rain, and none of these would presumably be blamed on climate change.
The Great Melt reaches its peak. The greatest seasonal change on the planet has taken place. The sea ice that once extended all the way to the horizon is now open ocean. In just 3 months, the sun has won its battle with the ice. Over 2.5 million square miles of ice has melted away, uncovering thousands of islands surrounded by open ocean. But in recent years, the scale of this melt has been growing. If future melts are as extreme as this one, bears like these may starve or drown, lost at sea. This is one of the last pieces of ice now adrift in the open ocean. The polar bear's icy world has melted away.
Take the Arctic, or Greenland, for example. Greenland is covered by a massive ice sheet that's kilometers thick in some places. In the summer, much of this ice is just barely staying frozen, and some places have even started melting. Now crank up the temperature a couple degrees Celsius. If that's enough to start a runaway melt, and the entire ice sheet melted, the sea level, on average, would rise by 7 meters. Imagine your favorite beach, underwater, coastal property destroyed. Entire islands and huge amounts of coastline submerged, and the millions of inhabitants forced to move elsewhere. You think your country has an immigrant problem now? Just wait until entire island nations are destroyed by the rising seas. And don't think the United States is exempt from these effects. Florida is particularly susceptible to even a small increase in sea level. Besides a third of the state potentially going under, all of its barrier islands would be well below sea level. And with them goes any protection from hurricanes. An already hard-hit state would become ground zero of increasingly powerful hurricanes. But this is all speculation, right? No one knows for sure just how many Floridians will be going for a dip in the near future. Well, SR15 has some hard numbers for us. The disparity in negative impacts between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees is truly shocking. At 1.5 degrees, 6% of insects, 8% of plants, and 4% of vertebrates will lose over half of their natural geographic range. At 2 degrees, those numbers increase to 18% of insects, 16% of plants, and 8% of vertebrates. 1.5 degrees is projected to destroy 90% of what remains of the world's coral reefs. 2 degrees is expected to wipe them out entirely, completely destroying one of the ocean's richest ecosystems. At 1.5 degrees of warming, we can expect to see a completely ice-free Arctic summer once every century. At 2 degrees, once every decade. Global annual catch rate for marine fisheries will drop by 1.5 million tons at 1.5 degrees, and by 3 million tons at 2 degrees. These figures go on, and each one could potentially trigger an avalanche of other negative effects. And we haven't even looked at the consequences for human life. It shouldn't be a surprise that the populations that will suffer the most will be the poorer and less developed countries, and those in fragile ecosystems, such as in agricultural or coastal areas. If we could limit the maximum global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, it would drastically reduce the number of people thrust into poverty and heightened risk of climatic events by up to several 100 million by 2050.
If the global warming trend still continues, there will not be another umbrella for Earth. So what can we do to redeem it? Reduce methane emissions.
If you want to do something about climate change, you want those fossil fuel companies to stop burning the reserves they've got, and you want them to behave differently. You do that by refusing to buy their shares.
Divestment says we do not accept your premise, we do not like what you're doing.
And in practical terms, it's about moving your money away from the problem and towards the solution.
So, you are encouraged to share your idea for it. Lastly, we hope all of you can move on with us to enlighten this problem together from now.